Think marriage is hard now. You argue about dishes, you argue about chores, maybe you're in therapy trying to untangle the emotional damage from growing up in different households. But at least you picked your partner, at least you had a choice. In the Middle Ages, your choice was usually made by your parents when you were 6. Your wedding wasn't a day of joy, it was a transaction. Your marriage night, not a private affair, but a public ritual, where your family and neighbors quite literally watched you get into bed, and if you were a woman, giving birth wasn't a miracle, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. Think couples therapy is tough. Try surviving a medieval marriage where your spouse could legally beat you, imprison you, or kill you, and still be considered a faithful husband. By the time we're done, your modern problems will feel like honeymoon drama. Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't the problem. Life was. Let's make one thing painfully clear. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love. It wasn't even about companionship. It was about survival, power, and control. And if you were a woman, it was the most dangerous legal contract you could ever sign. Because once the vows were exchanged, you weren't just promising loyalty, you were surrendering your body, your property, and your legal identity. Get married to the wrong person? You might not just regret it, you might not survive it. And walking away wasn't an option. Divorce didn't exist. Annulment was reserved for the powerful. Abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was often legally sanctioned. Your dowry, your status, your fertility, they were all part of a brutal, high-stakes chess game played by families desperate to stay afloat in a world of plagues, wars, and collapsing empires. Modern marriage might come with emotional baggage, but medieval marriage came with contracts written in blood and consequences that could follow you to the grave. Let's strip the romance from history. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't sacred, it was strategy. And if you were a daughter born into a wealthy or noble family, you weren't a child. You were a bargaining chip. From the moment you drew breath, your value wasn't measured in love or potential, but in land, inheritance, and bloodline. Parents negotiated your future like traders at a stock exchange, racing to lock down the best deal before the winds of war or disease erased your family's fortune. Take Margaret Beaufort. Married off at 12 to a man twice her age, not because she loved him, she didn't even know him, but because her inheritance made her the jackpot in a political game. Or Isabella of Valois, sent to marry the King of England at the age of 6, with dolls packed in her wedding chest and a contract that said, explicitly, don't touch her until she turns 12. Let that sink in. And no, these weren't fringe cases. This was the norm for the elite. Families would marry off daughters before they even knew how to write their own names, all to solidify alliances and avoid financial ruin. The younger the bride, the more secure the transaction, because a child couldn't protest, a child couldn't refuse, a child wouldn't even understand what was being stolen from her. And society, it cheered these marriages on. The church might have had rules, but money talked louder than morality. If the union benefited powerful families or nations, no one cared how young or unwilling the bride was. Love was irrelevant. Consent was a luxury. Your hand in marriage didn't belong to you. It belonged to whoever paid the highest price. Imagine the most private, intimate moment of your life becoming a public event, mandatory, watched, and judged. That was the reality of medieval wedding nights. Today, people post ring selfies and honeymoon pics. Back then, your community showed up to make sure your marriage was consummated, not just celebrated, sealed. Bedding ceremonies weren't just awkward traditions, they were legal proof. Because in a world where marriage was a contract, sex was the signature. Without consummation, the entire agreement could be annulled, dowries returned, alliances broken, futures lost. So the families made sure it happened, or at least made sure it looked like it happened. After the feast, the bride and groom weren't gently left alone. Oh no, the bride's female relatives would undress her, comb her hair, and tuck her into bed, offering cheerful advice about what came next. The groom's side did the same. Then they'd escort him into the room, close the bed curtains, and wait. Sometimes just outside. Sometimes still inside, watching from the shadows. And when it was over, they expected evidence, bedsheets, stains, testimonies. In high-stakes royal weddings, this process was documented like a military operation. For the poor girl inside the bed, it was humiliation dressed up as celebration. Even children weren't spared. Isabella of Valois, yes, the 6-year-old, was ceremonially bedded, though the act itself was postponed. Still, the ritual made one thing clear: her body, her future, her life, it all belonged to her new husband. These weren't traditions rooted in faith or celebration. They were tools of control, proof of dominance, legalization of ownership. And while not every couple endured this exact nightmare, peasants had simpler customs, and some regions softened the practice. The underlying message never changed. Marriage wasn't about privacy, it was about possession. If you thought the wedding night was brutal, childbirth was worse. In the Middle Ages, pregnancy wasn't a celebration, it was a warning. Every time a woman got pregnant, she was essentially stepping into a game of Russian roulette, where the odds were never in her favor. No antibiotics, no pain relief, no understanding of infection. You bled, you screamed, you prayed, and most of the time, you died. Margaret Beaufort, married at 12 and pregnant by 13, was so physically underdeveloped that her survival was considered a miracle. She gave birth to a future king and lost any chance of having more children. Her body was permanently damaged, her reproductive system shattered by one traumatic labor. She lived, but only just. And Margaret wasn't alone. 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or shortly after. Think about that. Every 3rd pregnancy was a potential death sentence. The wealthier you were, the more pregnancies you endured. 8, 10, sometimes 15. Because your value wasn't in your health. It was in how many male heirs you could produce before your body gave out. And when it did, there were always more girls waiting in line to replace you. Noble women were expected to breed like livestock. Eleanor of Aquitaine survived 10 pregnancies. Isabella of Aragon died at 18. The tragedy wasn't just the pain, it was the expectation. Women were told this was their purpose: pain, blood, trauma. That was the cost of being a wife. And the medical practices? If they didn't kill you, they certainly didn't help. Bloodletting during labor. Herbal concoctions that were more poison than cure. Birthing chairs that turned agony into spectacle. It didn't matter if you were a peasant or a queen. When labor began, you were on your own, with only luck, superstition, and a midwife's hands to guide you. And if you did survive, you were never the same. Torn muscles, chronic infections, prolapsed organs, these weren't complications. They were your new reality. You weren't praised for surviving. You were expected to do it again and again, until death finally gave you peace. So you made it through the wedding. You survived childbirth. Think the nightmare's over? It's only just begun. Because in the Middle Ages, your husband didn't just share your life, he owned it, legally, completely. Under the doctrine of reasonable chastisement, a man could beat his wife for any reason he deemed fit, as long as the stick wasn't thicker than his thumb. And that wasn't a metaphor, it was an actual rule. And if he wanted to go further, well, the law often looked the other way. Abuse wasn't a crime, it was a marital right. Take Henry VIII, the king who turned murder into marital policy. When his wives couldn't give him sons, he didn't just move on, he had them executed. Anne Boleyn, beheaded for adultery and incest with barely a shred of evidence. Catherine Howard, sent to the block for rumoured affairs. These women weren't guilty. They were inconvenient. And in a world where adultery was considered treason, especially for queens, execution wasn't extreme, it was expected. And the terrifying part? Henry wasn't breaking the system, he was using it exactly as designed. For women without royal titles, life wasn't safer. Divorce was nearly impossible. The church controlled every aspect of marriage and would only grant annulments under humiliating, often unattainable conditions. You had to prove the marriage was never consummated, which meant public testimony, invasive physical exams, and years of waiting, assuming you could afford the fees. Most couldn't. So you stayed, trapped in a house you couldn't escape, with a man who could legally imprison, assault, or starve you, and there was nothing you could do about it. No property rights, no court access, no identity. Once you were married, you ceased to exist as your own person. You were his. And if your husband decided he wanted you gone, he didn't need a reason. He just needed a story. Witchcraft, treason, adultery. The medieval courts didn't need much to condemn a woman, especially one without a man to protect her. And that was the point. Marriage was never about partnership. It was about power. And the only law more powerful than your husband's will was death. If you think money complicates modern relationships, you haven't seen a medieval dowry. This wasn't a wedding gift, it was a ransom. The bride's family had to pay the groom's family often everything they had just to secure the marriage. And they weren't paying for love, they were paying to transfer ownership of their daughter like she was land, livestock, or a sack of gold. Some dowries were worth the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Families would go into crippling debt just for the chance to secure a respectable husband. But once the ceremony was over and the dowry handed over, the bride was no longer theirs. She belonged to her husband, legally, completely. Isabella d'Este, one of the most powerful women of her time, had her marriage negotiated like a hostile business takeover. Her dowry came with land, cash, and lifelong political obligations. Her family didn't just marry her off, they sold a piece of their dynasty. But most women weren't as lucky. Once married, everything the bride owned, everything her family gave, became her husband's property. If he was kind, she might live a decent life. If not, too bad. Her family had no legal recourse, no refunds, no returns. The deal was done. And if he died, she might be left with nothing. Inheritance laws were stacked against women. Widows were often stripped of property and status, forced to remarry or enter convents just to avoid starving, not out of faith, but because there were no other options. And this wasn't rare, this was normal. Women who remarried did so out of desperation. Some married 5 or 6 times, each new husband a chance to survive. Others fell into poverty, forgotten by the very families that once sold them. The wealth they brought into a marriage didn't protect them. It made them more valuable, more controlled, more imprisoned. Medieval marriage was less a union and more a transaction, where the currency was human lives and the cost could bankrupt generations. And the cruelest part? Even if the family paid everything they had, there was no guarantee their daughter would be safe. Because once the dowry changed hands, she no longer mattered. Only the deal did. So here you are, married young, silenced by law, broken by childbirth, and stripped of everything you once had. And the only escape from this life? Death. That was the final, grim truth of medieval marriage. Divorce wasn't just rare, it was practically fiction. If your marriage was a cage, the only key was buried in the ground. And that ground came quickly. The average medieval marriage lasted just 15 to 20 years. Not because people were unhappy, but because people died. Plague, war, childbirth, disease, death was constant. And it didn't discriminate. It took brides, grooms, babies, priests, kings. The Black Death wiped out entire families before the ink dried on wedding contracts. People planned alliances only to bury half the wedding party the next day. And society adapted. Remarriage wasn't shameful, it was survival. Widows married fast, widowers married faster, sometimes within weeks. Not out of callousness, but necessity. You couldn't afford to be alone. Women who outlived multiple husbands might gain status and wealth if they played the game right. But most didn't. Most started over again and again until there was nothing left to start. Even the church recognized this cycle. Wedding ceremonies included blessings not just for love, but for the souls of the soon-to-be dead. Because everyone knew death wasn't a matter of if. It was when. The family trees of the Middle Ages looked like war maps. Step-siblings, half-siblings, remarried parents, multiple widows. No relationship lasted untouched. Emotional connection became dangerous. Why get too close when plague might take your partner tomorrow? And yet, people kept marrying, kept risking everything, because even in its darkest, deadliest form, marriage offered a kind of safety, a place, a role, a thread of stability in a collapsing world. So when medieval couples said, "Till death do us part," it wasn't romantic. It was a statement of fact. Death was the only way out, and it was always waiting. So the next time you're frustrated with modern marriage, when your partner forgets date night, or your in-laws overstep, or you're navigating the awkward silence of couples therapy, just remember this. At least you weren't sold at 6. At least no one watched you climb into bed to prove you were married. At least giving birth doesn't mean writing your will. And at least if things go wrong, you can leave. You can choose again. You can rebuild your life without a priest, a dowry negotiation, or a royal executioner. We live in a time where love is a choice, not a currency. Where consent isn't a loophole, but a right. Where a bad marriage might break your heart, but it won't take your name, your freedom, or your life. That luxury, that freedom, that's something our ancestors never had. So before you complain about dating apps or the divorce rate, ask yourself, would you rather swipe left or be stuck forever with someone your father chose for a sack of gold? And if this deep dive into medieval marriage made you cringe, flinch, or breathe a sigh of 21st century relief, share it. Because sometimes the only way to appreciate what you have is to remember how dark it used to be. And compared to what women endured back then, even your worst breakup might just be a fairy tale.